show, Chloe.
Kia ora.
Really appreciate your time. This was on a whim, so thank you very much.
It's all good.
Really appreciate it.
I'm sorry for leaving you hanging outside.
No, it's fine. It's fine. We're wondering, we're like,
yeah, I mean, I was coming from another meeting, bro. This is the campaign office is about to come back into full swing. We're in level 2.5 here in Auckland, so slowly but surely we will start having events back in here. But right now, it's been a bit of a ghost town for a while.
It's good. It's a real nice setup you have.
It is. It's super cool actually having a physical space. All of the things that we've actually got in here, like these tables and stuff, have been pulled together from the community.
Yeah,
so we
that's
just
cool.
I put out a call out on
that's
Instagram
cool.
and Facebook, and was like, we managed to lock down this main office, but we don't have any furniture. Can anyone help? And we got donated a bunch of things, which we'll give back to people afterwards. But I guess it's more practical than people just having it in storage. It's
for
helping
sure,
someone
for
out.
sure. One of the things I was curious is, why did you get into politics? Because to be honest, I first heard about you when you were running for mayor. I saw you on Facebook and I was like, what the? She's like 21, 22. And I was
22.
I was surprised. I was like, you were going against Phil Golf, which is, he's like a
former leader.
Former leader. And, he has... And I was like, wow, like this is really interesting. And I looked in more into your policies, and I was like, wow, like she is advocating for a lot of the common issues that young people face under the age of 30, 40. And I was, at that time I was really interested, and I'm glad you're here today. So why did you get into politics?
I also fell down a rabbit hole. So it was about going from a space of being somewhat reactive. I was involved in a huge number of kind of small businesses and pop-up exhibitions and community organisations. I was in independent radio broadcasting for a while. I worked actually just further along Karangahape Road at a venue called Neck of the Woods, where I arranged a bunch of different gigs and musical events as well. So I had a bunch of mates who were incredible creatives, musicians, artists. I'm not particularly creative myself, but loving what they were doing and seeing their potential, I was always the person who helped to organise and produce things. So realising all of the systemic barriers that were kind of in their way, particularly here in Auckland, there are so many awesome pockets of really cool people doing really cool things. But if you are just to fall in here without necessarily knowing anybody, it's very difficult to figure out where those places and spaces are and how to tee up and get connected with those people. And I think that it shouldn't be a matter of those people, those places, the kind of community being able to burst through those gaps. It should be the norm. So for me, it's very much been a process of attempting to elevate, highlight, support, and provide the systematic kind of approach to backing these creatives and these artists and these communities to realise their own autonomy. The real tipping point actually was the closure of this venue called the King's Arms in Eden Terrace. I keep pointing in the different geographical locations to where we are, but it's over in that direction. And it was one of these small to medium sized venues that had kind of served as a hub for young local musicians to get a foot in the door, build an audience, build some experience, try things out, take some risks, sometimes fail, sometimes go on to wild success. And effectively it was a planning failure because this really cheap apartment block was able to go up next door to it without any kind of level of insulation, which would make sense if you were building yourself next to an established music venue. But the regulations locally didn't recognise that there was an established music venue next door. So, of course, people moved in and started complaining about the noise. And that was kind of the death knell for a venue that was already going through some financial strife. And that was one of the kind of turning points for me. I was also at BFM, independent radio, just realising how all of the decisions that are made or not made by politicians impact our physical reality and the kind of opportunities that my community, my friends, my family have access to. And that was, the point at which I was at B, I was interviewing Phil Goff and John Polino and Mark Thomas and Vic Crone and, you know, all the people who were said to be the big guns, and I was just really dissatisfied with the fact that they didn't seem to really want to answer questions about where the city was going. You know, you can talk about rates or taxes all you want, but if you're not willing to engage in a conversation about the end point, why we are doing this, what the social contract actually means manifest, who we are, why do people live in this city, what is our culture, what is our identity, who are we in relation to the rest of the world, what's our value proposition. I just felt that it was really missing a trick, and I just got so pissed off that I was complaining to my producer Lillian, who's a really good mate of mine, and she was just like, Chloe, if you're going to complain about it, just do something about it. So I went home and I googled how to become mayor, and I was like, cool, have to be over the age of 18. I was 22, had to have 2 people nominate me, could tick that off, and had to have $200 to put through administration fees. And, you know, my starting point was always, of course, I don't know everything. I'm 22 years old. But of course, actually, any politician who stands in front of you and tells you that they know everything is either lying to you or completely lacking self-awareness, and I'm not sure which is worse. So I saw that advantage in recognizing that politicians, and having interviewed politicians for so long, that, you know, they can't know everything, and that they actually have to bring experts and community leaders and people who've dedicated their lives to solving these problems. And that's how I developed all of that policy. You know, it was the most detailed. I'd come out of, you know, studying philosophy and law and being involved in all of these kind of community projects. I was really used to justifying why I was there. So that's the approach.
That is, no, that's very interesting, because from the outset, people that don't know that story don't really know, you know, why you, as a 22-year-old, would really get into politics. But I've, you know, through my research, I'm very, very, you know, it's inspiring about the changes you're about to make, especially in terms of the referendum. And I was watching your interview with Helen Clark last night about the reasons why we should legalize cannabis and the benefits it would have to society. But again, with, you know, legalizing cannabis for the, you know, person who's in his 50s, 60s, who saw a lot of propaganda against cannabis, would be like, you're crazy, you're gonna, you know, cause more crime.
I've been hung up on by multiple talkback commentators who've had me on their show. So yes, I have been called crazy and naive and all of those other things.
So again, like, why should someone, let's say, you know, older, why should they believe in this new change? Like, what would benefits would bring to New Zealand?
Well, I think first and foremost, people need to recognise that the debate around cannabis reform isn't a debate about whether cannabis should exist, because cannabis does exist. And I find the greatest irony in the argument of criminal prohibitionists, people who advocate for the status quo, is that they use examples of how badly things are working right now to justify continuing the approach that we have right now. So the classic example is, you hear somebody say, well, cannabis has caused so much harm, why would you want to legalize it? And it's like, well, actually, because you're pointing to the failures of your status quo approach. The reason that I want to legalize it is to get control over that supply chain, to ensure that people who are using it, who do experience problems, have the opportunity to come forward and to get help if they need it, but also that adults can make informed, evidence-based decisions to reduce harm to themselves, to their whānau, their families, and their communities. So fundamentally, for me, I think that it's about going, okay, cannabis, like alcohol, like tobacco, any given substance can cause harm. So the next question actually has to be, what kind of legal, social, economic, justice approaches do you want to take to that substance? And right now, the approach that we take, pushing it underground, pretending that it doesn't exist, manifests the most possible harm ever. We have chaos. We have a free-for-all. Anybody who wants cannabis can get it. and you have no control over potency, drug dealers don't check ID, all of this profit is being ploughed into the criminal
But who's to
underground.
say that would not happen when it's legalized?
Well, effectively you have to recognise that if you look at the history of all different types of approaches to all different substances, so here, I mean, I could start invoking, for example, the approach in 1990 in Switzerland where they legalised heroin. They didn't legalise in the sense that most people think legalisation works. People hear the word legalise and they go, oh, there's going to be dairies, there's going to be corner shops, people are going to throw it from the rooftops. That is not what legalisation means.
Yeah.
Legalisation, by definition, is about putting a legal framework in place to control a substance. Prohibition is about saying that substance is banned and we're going to punish anybody who uses it. Hasn't worked, okay? So to park that situation in Switzerland, which I'm very happy to get to and unpack, because I think it's a very important example of how actually, if we genuinely want to grapple, particularly in New Zealand, with issues pertaining to methamphetamine or P,
big problem,
then we need to start being honest about the fact that our current approaches are demonstrably failing. So if you look at the different spectrum of approaches, right, on the one side of things, you've got effectively complete prohibition. So that's criminal prohibition, where we go, that's banned, it's illegal, anybody who uses it is going to be punished, anybody who supplies it is going to be punished. On the complete other end of the spectrum, the other extreme, you have complete commercialization, a free market, whereby anybody can advertise it, it can be sold to anybody, anywhere, there's no local community input on where shops end up cropping up. Both of those instances where you have black market and therefore criminal control, or free market and therefore corporate multinational control, both of those instances are instances of the most manifestation of harm to a community, because you have entities, whether they are underground criminal organizations or commercial organizations, that are incentivized to exploit vulnerable communities to make a quick buck, whether it is through lacing a substance that you sell to a kid with something stronger on the black market, or whether it is, advertising RTDs, alco pops to children, effectively. Both of those instances, bad. How you get away from those is regulation. Regulation in the middle is control not only of who can access it, so demand, but also access and control, rather, of supply. So this is the big distinction between decriminalisation and legalisation. Decriminalisation is simply about removing criminal penalties from the people who use a substance, but it's completely silent on the issue of supply. Supply and control of that supply means that you have to have licenses, regulation, and effectively control over who is able to sell it, whether it can even be sold, what level of potency is allowed to be produced, and the raft of other kinds of duties of care that you impose on the person who is providing this substance. So in the instance of, for example, one of the most harmful substances known to people, humankind, heroin. So in the 1980s, there was a spate in all across Europe, but Switzerland dealt with it in a really fascinating way, of heroin overdose deaths, of needles strewn in alleys and parks, families torn apart, people's lives ruined, more and more people filling up prison cells, all of these problems. And Ruth Dreyfus, who was the president of Switzerland, very pragmatic people, they decided that instead of going, we're going to try and ban that more than it's currently banned, just actually inspect the madness of that as a proposition. Instead of saying that, which is what the typical approach has been under the so-called war on drugs, which, by the way, is entirely baseless rhetoric, but anyway, I'm not going to get into that. It's ludicrous. So they said, we're actually going to control the supply of this substance. Right now, you have a whole bunch of people who are trapped in this cycle of getting high and then effectively chasing that high. And in order to chase that high, they will sell everything that they own. They will commit petty crimes, which potentially escalate the more that they need, the more that they become embroiled in the criminal underground, because they have to keep rubbing shoulders with people who do not fit within the normal kind of parameters of society. When you push something underground, you force people to interact with people who we otherwise know as criminals. And again, there's so much social commentary that we could get into in terms of alternative structures of identity and social organisation and otherwise, but we're not doing a psychology class. So Effectively, they said, we are going to instead create a legal framework where people who are addicted to this substance will come and have it prescribed to them by medical professionals. So they set up not retail shops, but they set up clinics for prescription to people who had heroin addictions. So if you have a heroin addiction, you could come in, you could be prescribed your heroin, which would be administered to you by a medical health professional. It would be of a certain level of potency. It also would not have any other substances cut into it, which is what happens again in the criminal underground. And also you would be provided with what's called wraparound care. So that wraparound care would be, you know, if you're homeless, we'll get you a house. If you need a job, we will help subsidize an employer to give you a job. You need mental health care, we'll give you mental health care. You need to reconnect with your family, we will help you with that. All of these things effectively came way before we started to understand, as we do in contemporary psychology, the issues of what drives mental health and addiction. The precipitating factors to mental health and addiction, as outlined in this government's mental health and addiction inquiry, Hiara Oranga, is, in a nutshell, you can have a biological predisposition inherited from your parents towards
Wait, are we talking about P babies or regardless of P babies?
No, regardless of that. So, I mean, that's potentially one of the things. So is FASD, fetal alcohol syndrome.
Yeah.
So that's one of the more extreme versions of that. But in terms of mental health, you can have some hereditary genes which can be triggered effectively by your environment. So you can have these underlying things inside of you, and based on your life experiences, your circumstances, the people who come into your life, all manner of different events, those underlying biological predispositions can be triggered, or they can be kind of turned up or down on the dial. And effectively what we find is that the two major driving factors of addiction in particular are isolation and trauma. And right now, our major social, legal, economic, justice response to people who are experiencing addiction is to further isolate and traumatize them. And we keep going, well, why does this keep getting worse? Well, maybe it's because we're ignoring the evidence, you know? So effectively what I'm trying to point out there is not, you know, this argument that we should just go, hey, let's free everything up, because that's not what legalization is about. In fact, it is about instituting different frameworks that take into account evidence, that ensure that people who need help can get it, and that we stop wasting all of this resource on these mythologies that we've built on the war on drugs so that we can look like strong men and beat our chests.
Yeah, no, the war on drugs is, as you said, baseless. We're not fighting the root of the problem. We're fighting the symptoms.
Absolutely.
And I think, especially with loneliness and, you know, abuse, I think if trauma, you know, if they were to respond to that at a very early age, you could see, you know, dramatic results.
And that's where, I mean, if you were to talk about things like poverty, for example, one of the kind of major conversations that's been occurring, particularly in Aotearoa of late, has been the issue of child poverty. And again, just to unpack that on an economic basis, you speak to people who operate in NGOs and in spaces of actually trying to solve these problems on the coalface, on the front lines. And child poverty is a construct that was effectively a way to try and help people empathize with family poverty. Because we have become so cold-hearted as a broader society by virtue of, I think, deeply individualistic economic reforms that occurred in the 1980s, particularly here, but, you know, they also equated to, in similar time frames, what was happening in the US and the UK. Effectively, you've ended up with a society that sees poor people as to blame for their own poverty, as opposed to recognizing that in order to get certain outcomes in life, you need hard work plus circumstance. A whole lot of people do not have that circumstance, which is the critical ingredient to make the hard work mean something.
For sure. There is a luck component of which family you're born in, you know, which environment you're born in, which neighborhood you're born in.
And that's the point of the social contract. The point of the social contract is to enable people to reinvest in the society that help them to flourish so that other kids in the future have the same opportunities that they did. But we seem to ignore all of that when we talk about the kind of economy that we're building.
I think there is an extreme lack of awareness of the complexity of these issues. I think most people, that I've talked to, and people that are against it, view it as black and white. Either it's good or bad, legalize or criminalize. But there is these gray areas where it's not talked about, not understood, and I think that is why most people are scared about it, and they don't want it's a sort of it's bringing out the worst. They're thinking the worst in that legalization.
But also, I think it's probably a fundamental misunderstanding of, like, it's that misalignment, right? To use kind of business speak between the slogan and the KPIs. Like, the key performance indicator surely of drug policy should be how many people are using the substance. Yeah. How harsh the substance is becoming, how potent it's becoming, how many people are being imprisoned, whether you're getting control of what some people characterize or caricature as the drug problem. Yeah. The slogan is the war on drugs, but if you actually look at the data, the stats, the evidence, the war on drugs has been the biggest proponent and cause of the explosion of drug problems across the world over the past 40 or 50 years. In fact, if you are to marry those two things up, to marry up the KPIs of, we want less people in prison, we want less people addicted to these substances, we want these substances to be less potent, we want less families torn apart, we want this issue to get better, then we need to deal with the slogan and the kinds of things that we are doing. Because, I mean, to talk about, for example, the birth of the war on drugs, I mean, primarily coming out of the United States.
Was that the Reagan administration?
Yeah. Reagan and Nixon. And, there's a Nixon advisor who went on the record in, I think it was 2012, you'll be able to look it up, who said that, they were very conscious of the reality that, the DEA that they were building, the Drug Enforcement Agency, it wasn't actually about the drugs. It was about particularly targeting and breaking up meetings, vilifying the leaders of, and destroying communities of the civil rights blacks and the anti-war left. Yeah. Like, that sounds like a conspiracy theory. Yeah. But it is on the record as the very intention. You can look into the research, or you can just decide to engage in an uncritical way with the way that things are presented through, our political leaders or, mainstream media platforms or whatever else. And that's not to say that, I'm going to bag out mainstream media journalists, many of whom are doing incredible jobs. But it is to say that there is a divergence between facts and how those facts are represented.
Yeah, no, that's the point of baseless assumptions, and those assumptions are sort of put into policy that do affect common people in these communities.
Don't leave politics to politicians is my
point. But that's another thing. It's like inherently people distrust politicians. I don't know if I can blame them of all the data out there that politicians abuse their power, are often not thinking of self-serving, not thinking about the people they're serving, but rather themselves.
Well, I mean,
that's in Hollywood, that's in everywhere, and that's the narrative that people are fed. And now, how can we expect most people to believe in our politicians?
Well, this is the thing that drives me AWOL about the notion that people are supposedly apathetic. Apathy presumes that people are able to access information about the stuff that affects them, and inside politics and inside law there is so much gatekeeping that goes on with the language that's used to make it inherently inaccessible to the average person. But then you add on top of that the fact that actually when you decide to disengage from politics, you actually let the bad guys get away with everything that they're already doing. People who are in power, who hold all of the power and wealth at the moment, people who don't want things to change because they benefit massively from the status quo and getting away with whatever they want, benefit when average people decide not to engage in politics. So, the baseline of that is they don't want you to vote. So of course they're going to invest everything in making politics look as despicable and disgusting as possible. And that's the greatest perversity of our democracy, is that You know, in a country as small as ours, in particular, we're smaller than Melbourne in New Zealand with 5 million people, 2 degrees of separation. Things can change really quickly if we want them to. And I genuinely believe that if somebody like me, you know, I'm a high school dropout with tattoos who swears too much, I'm not supposed to be in politics. But if somebody like me, with the backing of a community, can end up inside of our House of Representatives, it's demonstrative of the fact that anybody can and anybody should. Because democracy actually does belong to all of us if we want it to. If you don't like your politicians, you have to recognise that politicians are there either because you voted for them or you neglected to vote for an alternative. And if you don't like or trust any of the lineup in front of you, cool, but it's not a great protest and you're actually doing worse than nothing if you just decide to sit on the sidelines. If you want to change something, you need to realise that you need to be in the game. And the way that you do that is you find someone in your community who you do like and you do trust, and you actively support them in running.
But that's, again, like the common teen or just 18 or 19 in their 20s or uni. They just, maybe they're not interested in politics and they don't really see that cause and effects of policies.
Well,
what do you say to those people? I'm sort of in that boat. Like,
totally.
I don't, you know, politicians, I don't know. Policies, I don't know. So I'm like, sort of in the middle ground of like, you know, who should I vote for? So that's.
Well, I think the key point there is, you know, your boss is voting, your landlord is voting, everybody who you complain about is voting. And, you know, the air that you breathe, the water that you drink, the food that you eat, the house that you live in, the cost, the quality, the accessibility of all of those things are determined by political decisions. Everything that you complain about is political. Your mere existence is political. The fact that we have freedom to have this conversation is political. And, you know, again, I just think that it is part and parcel of not necessarily seeing ourselves in a time and a place that can affect change, which again only serves to benefit those who currently are profiteering off of the status quo, which is fundamentally exploiting a whole bunch of people and the planet, which is what deters a whole bunch of younger people in particular from engaging in politics. So, you know, if you're to ask me what the fuse breaker is there, I think it can genuinely only be collective action. I think it can genuinely only be kind of community building. And here's where culture is so important, because from a design thinking perspective, culture by definition is about a shared set of values. And the problem with talking about it in that way is so many people have preconceived ideas as culture being synonymous or interchangeable with ethnicity or religion or someone's geographical background. Culture is not inherently or necessarily those things. It can be a proxy for understanding culture, but culture by definition is a shared set of values. As soon as you understand that, you understand how we can have societies that are multifaceted, that have people from all these different ethnic backgrounds, all these different religions, that share different ideas, that come together to produce a society that can evolve, that can bounce off of each other, that can create, that can be critical, that can innovate, that can collaborate. And we right now are not really leaning into the opportunity that that presents, because we're all told that we all have to fight amongst each other. You know, if you're having a bad time, think about it like the other person in your class is the problem. The fact that you're not getting, you know, top of the class marks or whatever, or somebody else is being promoted over you and that person's therefore the problem. In fact, if you take a step back and look at it from a macro perspective, you start to realize that all of this stuff is systematic, it's systemic, and there is an opportunity for all of us to contribute in the ways that our skill sets would actually benefit everybody if we could, you know, survive, let alone thrive. But there's a whole bunch of kind of barriers in the way, and that's what's political.
Yeah, no, like what you're saying is 100% true. But I mean, like for the person that's working 45 hours a week, they just don't know enough about politics. They don't know enough about the social construct.
I push back on that. Okay. So they don't know about the terminology, right? And that's where I'm really conscious of trying not to be as annoyingly pseudo-philosophical as I know I can be. But I also think that there is something to realize, and I've been door knocking up and down this country, and I have been to regional areas, I've been to urban areas, I've been all over the place, North and South Island, and I can tell you for a fact that younger people do not have a monopoly on ignorance when it comes to politics, right? There are a whole bunch of people who don't know next to anything about politics, who make a whole lot of decisions about all of our lives because they're the ones who are deciding to vote. And they're doing that based on headlines or what Mike Hosking said on Talkback Radio. The reason that I say that is, we just haven't quite recognized what our power is and could be if we collectivized, if we actually, you talk about the person working 45 hours a week and, making minimum wage, and things are really hard and they're paying exorbitantly high rent. The minimum wage is political. It's set by politicians. How much rent you're paying is political. It's set by politicians through the policies that they enable, certain levels of investment or development, and the way in which people can be exploited or not exploited. And the market has flow-on effects as a result of those decisions. So it's just about realizing that you have the opportunity to change that, particularly if you see yourself as something bigger than just yourself.
Yeah.
Because that's the other thing, right? Is a lot of people kind of go, oh, well, I'm just one vote, I can't change anything.
A lot of people think that, yeah.
But bro, you're not just one person. If you put all of the one person in this room, we would not be able to move.
Yeah.
You need to realize that you have the opportunity to touch base with all of your mates who might think the same thing, and then hey presto, you've got like 25 other people who all think that their vote doesn't count, but actually that amount of people can swing an electorate seat. That can change who ends up winning in your local area, which in turn can change the composition of parliament, which in turn can change decisions that are made based on the votes that are had in parliament. This is all about the chain of accountability and the chain of effectively community members being actively involved in the way that their values manifest through politics.
No, I definitely agree. And one of the things that I don't hear politicians talking enough about is UBI and the future of work. One thing I've been very fascinated about the last few months is studying, the implications of new technology in our society. Look at the factory workers, look at the process-oriented workers. These are all
Drivers.
at risk. Drivers.
Yeah.
These are I don't think people understand the risk involved in automating these processes. Maybe not in the next 5 years, but definitely in the next 15 years.
Yeah.
This could be a real possibility.
Yep.
And I don't hear enough about, what is the government doing that to prepare the young people, or not even young people, people in their 40s or 50s, because retirement age would go up as more people, as the life expectancy does go up.
Yes and no, right? I mean, we have to ask ourselves again, what's the point? Like, what are we actually trying to achieve here in the way that we've geared our economy? Because, I mean, even the notion of GDP or gross domestic product as, the KPI of success is inherently flawed. You only have to ask the guy who invented GDP, Simon Kuznets, who literally took it to US Congress in the 1930s, and he's like, hey, here's a really good way to measure economic transactions in the domestic market, but God forbid do not use it as a measure of welfare. And then 80 years later, we all did that. It is literally a measure of economic transactions. GDP goes up as a result of someone getting cancer, or someone being in a car crash, or a natural disaster, or an oil spill, because you have to have economic transactions in order to undo that social ill. There has to be money circulating around the economy. So in fact, we need to be asking ourselves far more granular and nuanced questions about what is the value of these transactions? Who does it actually benefit? And do we actually want these kinds of transactions anyway? Because, ironically, there were some papers, ironically or really sadly, depressingly, there were some papers that were leaked from one of the major multinational oil companies who were trying to justify building a rig off the coast of Australia in
BP?
about 2006. And they had effectively, in their risk mitigation section of that document, outlined that, if there is an oil spill, that's all G, because, it will stimulate the local economy. these are the kinds of perverse decisions, or rather rationale for decisions, that are able to be used when we have entirely skewed the values that we're putting at the forefront of the decisions that we're making.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, I think if you're talking about things like, you know, the fact that in the next 15 years, the economy as we know it, the kinds of jobs that people are going to do are going to look entirely different, then we need to recognize that, again, the economy, if you're to break it down based on definition, the economy is simply allocation of resources. So do we have enough to go around? What are we trying to produce, and for whom?
Mm-hmm.
Because at present, the way that we've geared our economy is to produce things to excess. We have concepts known as planned obsolescence. The fact that your phone will only work for like 2 years before the iOS will freeze it up, so you can't use it anymore, by which point you need to get new hardware, new software. You know, this cycle of make, break, waste, chuck away is not only contributing to the immense anxiety that not only younger people, but people of all demographics feel to constantly keep up, to make money in order to keep up. But it also contributes to all of these massive issues with regards to resource extraction, with regard to pollution, particularly of like our planet's waterways. And, you know, the fact that by 2050 there's going to be more plastic in our oceans than fish, you know, which in turn impacts our food supply chain, which in turn impacts the health of humanity.
Yeah.
And I just think that we don't quite recognize that, like, the amazing number of things that had to happen for humanity to be plausible on this like tiny little speck floating in the middle of space,
1 in a trillion.
and how great we think we are that we get to, you know, spend this money and, you know, throw things away and the rubbish just goes away. We never think about the process for that. But yeah, to the core of your question, the reason that politicians are not actively engaging in these conversations right now is because the horizon for political decisions is so short. The reason that the horizon for political decisions is 3 or 4 years is because of the way that political terms work, and because there is a real mismatch in the goals of democracy and the goals of politicians. And the reason for that is the incentive structure is entirely skewed. Think about the decisions, you know, in a very broad brush binary, the decisions that politicians like me make on a day-to-day basis, and I've seen this particularly have quite perverse and sad impacts on other politicians that I know who came in at the same time as me. Broad brushstroke, on a daily basis, you kind of choose one of two things. You choose to try to attempt to create change, and you can prioritize that, or to preserve your career. And whichever one you choose, whichever given day, you basically end up deprioritizing the other.
Mm-hmm.
And what happens is, sadly, a number of people end up justifying choosing their career because they rationalize that if they are there, they in the future can do some of that change stuff. But the greatest problem with thinking like that is not only is it deeply self-centered, but it also means that you sit down, shut up, wait 10 years until you're allowed to have an opinion, by which point in time you're so indoctrinated that you have no idea what your opinion is, because you've had to sit down, shut up, and be part of this broader kind of heaving mass of whatever the hierarchy is saying goes. So,
but isn't that the problem? That term structure?
That is the problem.
So, like, how can, because I know the opposition wants to change, like, National wants to change a lot of the...
Well, Nick Smith does. That's not actually a National Party position.
Okay, maybe, yeah. But now that Labour has all these initiatives and then another party comes in and then, you know, doesn't prioritize those initiatives, which might inherently fail if they're not followed through well, then, you know, the next party comes along, does the same thing to the other party. Like, then you would not really see...
Yeah, so
significant change.
It's not so much the short-termism of, you know, the oscillating of government, because that is it's a given. You're always going to have changes in, changes out. It's more to do with how much progress can be discerned within a certain period of time. So the first thing that I would say is there's a reason I'm not in the Labour Party. I'm in the Greens because Green Party MPs typically have a far shorter shelf life, and the reason for that is I mean, firstly, we are deeply overworked because we're a smaller caucus, so we have, you know, approximately a dozen different portfolios each, whereas in larger parties you're lucky to have one. But on top of that, you know, if you were going to value your values and change over your own personal popularity, or stick your neck out and take a risk on something, think about the fact that I'm the only politician right now who's really known about talking about the controversial issue of cannabis. The reason for that is none of the other ones want to risk their career. You know, I don't care. I am deeply angry about the fact that 1,300 Māori are criminally convicted every single year for a low-level cannabis offence that 80% of the population will engage in their lifetime. You know, like, this kind of stuff is perfect example of that misalignment of the incentives that politicians have right now versus the kind of things that we expect out of our democracy or our House of Representatives. So if you're talking about how to try and fix that, I mean, one of the best ways to actually fix it is to ensure that everybody is fully 110% engaged in our democracy. And if that was to happen, then you wouldn't have such a thing as career politicians, because there would always be somebody else who is waiting to actually try and institute change or to agitate for it. You would constantly have very public debates around what kind of policy approaches we're actually taking and how we can progress as a society. But while everybody is deeply overworked, has to have their head down and, you know, fight their way to survive, working 45, 80 hours a week, you know, barely scraping by to pay rent and look after their family or whatever other things are on their immediate day-to-day plate, they don't have time to look up and see the structures that make their life hard. So, you know, if we recognize that all of us who are going through these similar struggles actually have an opportunity to change the system that is the precipitating factors for that struggle that we face, then everything can change. And then, you know, my pet favourite topic is constitutional reform, but maybe that's for another time. That's at least 2 hours.
Maybe on the next one. No, it is really surprising because the incentive structures are, as you said, highly skewed that, you know, make politicians
value their career.
Yeah. And how much do you think it's emotional decision making, sort of based on maybe the narrative of their party or based on their own value system?
So, I mean, one of the to use that example that I just threw out, right? I know for a fact that there are politicians in every single political party right now in Parliament who are in support of what I've put on the table in terms of drug law reform, but they won't say it because they don't want to upset the apple cart and lose their position in the hierarchy. And, you know, you have to balance that or counterweight it against the fact that New Zealand actually has the most what's called whipped parliament in the world. So it is highly unlikely that you ever see members of parliament crossing the floor from their own political party.
True.
One of the many reasons for that is potentially the short term, potentially also just how small our parliament is, that you become a sitting target if you are to engage in that expression of values which may be divergent from your political party. Another argument is that the way that our electorate system operates under MMP has made it really difficult for people to diverge individual politicians from their political party, which is where you get notions such as safe seats. So there's a number of different explanations for it, but ultimately I just think it's kind of sad. And one of the easiest fuse breakers that I can think of is voting. Like, holy, there's last stats I saw, 61% of people aged under 24 are currently enrolled to vote. For people over the age of, I think it's 50, the figure is like 95%. Jesus. And as of last election, people under the age of 35 outnumbered everybody else. everybody else in terms of the voting population. But we do not use the power of that vote. And that's because of reasons that we were talking about at the top, you know. And I also don't want that to be taken as I think that everybody who's younger is going to vote in the same way, because they're not. Young people are not homogenous in the same way that older or middle-aged people are not homogenous. But it just so happens that people are able to dismiss and patronize younger people's voices in the political process because we don't choose to use that process or that system to our advantage in the same way that other demographics do.
Yeah, no, definitely. As we talked before, that, you know, when you had Helen Clark on your interview last night, and I said that, you know, she is one of the reasons why me and my family and community are here. And you spoke about how per capita New Zealand still isn't
pulling our weight.
Yeah. And I am surprised because in my community we are majority refugees. We, just as my own experience looking around, I think that nearly every single person has their own business, hiring more than 5 people, and they're having a huge positive impact on the economy. Let's just talk about economics of just how much, you know, revenue they're bringing in the government. And I think people are still hesitant to increase the numbers of how many we're supporting and sponsoring in New Zealand, although we have the capacity to.
Yeah. So I understand, and I have been engaged in this in the past, of justifying the rationale, or creating the rationale rather, for increasing the refugee quota on the basis of economics, because you know, people who are against it use economics as a defense. But I also think, you know, to really unpack that in a critical way, they don't actually care about economics. It's not about economics. It's primarily about racism. It's about fear. It's about ignorance. And ignorance is not necessarily an aggression or a vitriolic ignorance. It can come from not necessarily having been exposed to people who are different, or different ideas, or any of those kinds of things. But you know, I remember I was really fortunate actually as a kid to have exposure to my grandma worked at the Mangere Refugee Centre for 13 years.
Wow.
So as I was growing up, I got to go there with grandma after school, and I remember the first time that, you know, she was introducing me to some kids, and there was this 13-year-old boy who, you know, where he was from had been a boy soldier, and he screamed as he was going to sleep every night, and he had immense PTSD and just so many behavioral problems by virtue of the things that he'd been through. And that's actually really related to the stuff we were saying before about the experiences people go through and how that impacts the forms of escapism that they might end up seeking out, whether it's in substances or other forms of addiction or whatever else. But, you know, he engaged in some forms of self-harm and other kinds of things, and he was like my age. And I remember, you know, talking to my grandma and seeing this boy who was from the other side of the world, and by virtue of the luck of where I was born, I hadn't been through the circumstances that he had. And he was born on the other side of the world and had effectively gone through so much trauma and torture and violence and just awful things that you'd never want a kid to be exposed to. And I think this is one of the big things that we miss in the conversations about, you know, refugee numbers and otherwise, is we lose the humanity of the people that we're talking about. We lose the fact that, you know, of course these people can contribute and can help us thrive as a nation on, you know, particularly an international scale, if we're talking about economics or whatever else. But we're also just talking about people who've been through some real heavy things. And, you know, surely if you were born in those circumstances and, you know, you looked around and saw the potential future for your kids, that they would be exposed to that level of trauma and violence and whatever else, you would do anything to get them out of that. And I just hope that that's actually the conversation that we can start having, because that opens doors to compassion and empathy. If people actually go, oh yeah, I understand now why these people are looking for safety and why New Zealand looks like a really good place to be, and how simply because I was born here, you know, I'm not entitled to any greater level of safety than they are.
No, honestly, you know, thank you for your time. It's been honestly an intellectually stimulating conversation, and I hope you do well with the referendum and also, you know, the election that's coming up. And I hope, you know, people sign up to vote, and it's predominantly young people that are listening to this podcast. And yeah, no, thank you very much. I appreciate your time.
No, thank you.
Thank you. Cheers.